For 6 long years, the world barely heard from Susan Boyle. After suffering a devastating stroke in 2022, many believed her career had quietly ended. Doctors warned the damage might be permanent. One side of her face stopped moving. Words came slowly and unevenly, and the voice that once stunned millions struggled to produce even a single note. But in February 2026, something unexpected happened. Simon Cowell announced that he wanted Susan back for the biggest anniversary season of Britain's Got Talent. A bold invitation. But it raises a powerful question. Could the woman who once shocked the world with her voice really return after such a devastating setback? And perhaps an even deeper question. What kind of determination does it take to rebuild a voice that once seemed lost forever? To understand that answer, we need to go back decades, long before fame, before the applause, and long before the world knew her name. A difficult beginning. Blackburn smelled of coal dust and damp wool in those years. The stone houses, the kitchen steam that fogged the windows, the church bell that cut across winter mornings. Susan was born there on April 1, 1961, the youngest of 9 children in a crowded working-class home filled with faith, music, and constant noise. Her mother, Bridget Boyle, was 47 when she became pregnant with Susan, a risky pregnancy even by modern standards. Doctors warned that continuing could threaten her life. They advised termination. But Bridget refused. Her Catholic faith was strong, and she chose to continue the pregnancy despite the risks. When Susan was finally born, complications nearly cost the newborn her life. She briefly suffered oxygen deprivation and had to be placed in an incubator. Doctors made a grim prediction. The child would likely struggle mentally and might never achieve anything extraordinary. Those words followed Susan for decades. How often do early labels decide someone's future, before they've even had the chance to prove themselves? The misdiagnosis that changed everything. Because of the complications at birth, doctors told Susan's parents she had brain damage. In the 1960s, medical understanding was limited. The diagnosis went unquestioned. And so the label stuck. At school, Susan struggled socially and academically. Classmates mocked her, calling her cruel nicknames. Bullying became part of daily life. Teachers often assumed she couldn't keep up. The constant ridicule slowly eroded her confidence. Years later, Susan would reveal something shocking. The diagnosis had been wrong all along. Specialists discovered, when she was 51, that she had Asperger syndrome, a form of autism, not brain damage. For more than 5 decades, she had carried a misunderstanding that shaped how the world treated her. Imagine that for a moment. How different might someone's life be if people understood them correctly from the beginning? The one place she felt safe. Home offered a different truth. Music. Her father, Patrick Boyle, loved to sing at a local pub, his voice rough with coal-dusted vowels but steady like a hearth. Bridget encouraged music inside the house. Those simple family moments planted seeds. At 12, Susan began singing in church and school choirs. When she sang, something changed. The anxiety faded. The laughter disappeared. For the shy girl who otherwise felt invisible, music became a refuge. The sound she made, warm, controlled, and unexpectedly powerful, felt like an answer to a prayer. A dream that refused to die. Despite bullying and doubt, Susan pursued music. In the 1990s, she trained with vocal coach Fred O'Neill, learning breathing techniques and strengthening a powerful mezzo-soprano. But success didn't come quickly. Studio doors stayed shut, labels ignored her demos, small charity CDs gathered dust on shelves. Most people would have given up. But Susan didn't. How many people quit just one step before their lives could have changed forever? The night that changed everything. In 2008, Susan applied to audition for Britain's Got Talent. She was 47. On April 11, 2009, she walked onto the Glasgow stage in a modest dress and coat. Skepticism hung in the air. When she said she wanted stardom like Elaine Page, some laughed. Even the famously tough judge Simon Cowell seemed unconvinced. Then she opened her mouth and sang Les Miserables. No, not the book itself, but the song from it. Her voice cut across the auditorium in a way nobody had expected. Laughter died. Phones recorded. By the final note, the audience stood and millions at home were stunned. The internet moved fast and a new kind of fame was born. And yet she didn't win the competition. She finished second. What mattered wasn't the trophy. It was the way her voice changed the room. Fame arrived in other ways. Albums, sold-out concerts, shows on 3 continents, and legions of fans who found something genuine and unpretentious in her presence. She became, for many, a symbol of late-blooming possibility. The fall and the long quiet. Years of touring, small-town hospital visits, and studio lights took their toll. Then, in 2022, Susan's body betrayed her in a way that few men and women in the public eye have to face: a stroke. Overnight, the rhythm that had guided her life, breathing control, the habitual placement of sound, the muscular memory of performance, was scrambled. Rehabilitation became a new stage. Unlike record producers or television cameras, therapists offered repetitions, tedious, precise work. Speech therapists taught her to shape vowels again. Physiotherapists helped her walk steadily when the left side of her body felt foreign. The mirror became a character in her daily drama. She and the reflected face learning to trust one another's movements. How do you rehearse hope? Where do you find the patience to say the same clumsy syllable 50 times a day? Small triumphs. The first time Susan hummed a scale without tears, she surprised the therapist and herself. The sound was small, breathy almost, but the act of producing it felt monumental. She learned to hold notes for a few seconds, then 10, then 15. She practiced opening her mouth wider. She learned to place her tongue differently. A played-back recording of her was both heartbreaking and promising. It was her voice, altered and raw, searching its way back. Friends and neighbors from Blackburn left flowers and recordings of themselves singing to encourage her. Sometimes the fan letters brought tears, strangers who spoke of how Susan's earlier performances had helped them through grief or loneliness. The world she'd touched reached back. Was fame a gift or a responsibility? For Susan, the answer was both. The invitation. When Simon Cowell publicly invited her back for the anniversary season of Britain's Got Talent, the reaction was thunderous. Supporters urged caution. Critics asked whether it was fair or whether it would be cruel television. But many more people felt a surge of hope. Maybe the impossible return was possible. Susan's first thought was not about cameras. It was about the work, how much physical and vocal preparation she needed. She asked herself, am I returning to perform, to make a point, to close a chapter, or to open a new one? Rehearsal, again. Rehearsals were unlike the old ones. Gone were the long, uninterrupted vocal runs, replaced by short, deliberate exercises. The vocal coach worked with her on breath control and resonance, asking her to imagine colors and textures as she sang a note to help her place it. They built phrases as a mason lays bricks, one careful stone at a time. There were days when frustration hit like a storm. Her left cheek stayed stubbornly still, consonants stumbled, an intended crescendo collapsed into a whisper. But there were also moments of startling clarity, a perfect vowel, a sustained note that tasted like triumph. Each small victory was celebrated like a chorus line doing a successful turn. Who are we if not the sum of our attempts, repeated until they become habit? The performance. On the night Susan stepped back into the studio lights, it felt both familiar and new. Cameras hummed like distant wasps. The audience's breath was a collective weather. Some viewers expected a coda of pity, others hoped for a miracle. Susan walked on stage supported by musicians, friends, and the invisible muscle memory of 1,000 rehearsals. When she sang, the sound was different than before, wiser, seasoned, edged by the fragility of someone who had almost lost her voice. It wasn't the same power that once climbed effortlessly to a phrase. It was a voice rebuilt with intention and scars. The silence that followed the final note was not the stunned silence of viral surprise, but something more intimate, the hush of people who had witnessed a human return. What did we learn watching her that night? That resilience is not the absence of struggle, but the decision to stand and sing again despite it. The headlines debated the fairness of bringing someone back after such trauma. Commentators on television panels spoke carefully about mental health, about pressure, about the fragile boundary between inspiration and exploitation. Some wondered if returning to the spotlight was too much, too soon. Others believed it was exactly the kind of moment the world needed. But for many, fans, neighbors, and people who had lost their own voices in different ways, Susan's performance meant something deeper. It was not simply a return to television. It was a quiet promise. It was proof that lives can bend and still continue forward. In the months that followed, Susan gradually returned to a quieter rhythm of life. The large arenas and television studios became less frequent. Instead, she performed at local concerts, charity events, and community gatherings where the crowds were smaller but the connection felt more personal. She spent time mentoring young singers who came to her not only for vocal guidance but also for encouragement. She spoke openly about patience, about the slow arithmetic of recovery, small steps adding up to something larger. And the deeper question remained, one she often asked herself in quiet moments. How does a life measured in unexpected turns make peace with both its past and its present? For Susan, the answer arrived in fragments. In the forgiving smiles of family members who had watched her struggle and rise again. In the steady routine of therapy sessions that helped rebuild strength. In the applause that now tasted different, softer, more meaningful, because she understood how easily it could disappear. In the end, the story was never just about a comeback or a single night on television. It was about the architecture of a life built through repetition and resilience. It was about the kindness of people who refused to let a neighbor fade quietly into the background. And it was about the stubborn courage of a woman who, despite early misdiagnosis and late obstacles, kept learning how to sing again and again. What happens when the world believes your voice is gone? And what kind of strength does it take to keep speaking anyway? Yet somehow, through all the noise and doubt, Susan Boyle became the biggest star the show had ever produced. From unknown to global sensation. After that unforgettable audition, Susan's life changed with breathtaking speed. One week she was living quietly in her small Scottish town, walking the same familiar streets and chatting with neighbors who had known her for decades. The next week, videos of her singing were spreading across the internet, watched by millions of people around the world. People who had never heard her name suddenly knew it. Her debut album, I Dreamed a Dream, was released later in 2009. The result stunned the music industry. The album debuted at #1 in both the United Kingdom and the United States, an achievement many established artists spend entire careers chasing. Within weeks, the record sold millions of copies. Within months, it had become one of the fastest-selling debut albums in modern music history. Eventually, the total surpassed 10 million copies worldwide. For someone who had spent most of her life being underestimated, the moment was extraordinary. At nearly 50 years old, Susan Boyle had become one of the biggest new stars in music. But fame carries its own weight. And pressure, when it arrives suddenly, can be overwhelming. The hidden struggles behind fame. Global attention arrived like a storm. Susan had lived most of her life quietly, far from flashing cameras and crowded red carpets. She was used to familiar faces and predictable routines. Suddenly, every moment seemed public. Tabloid reporters chased her for stories. Photographers waited outside her home. Television crews asked deeply personal questions. Every detail of her life became something strangers believed they could discuss. The stress slowly began to build. Soon after the talent show finale, Susan was admitted to a clinic for exhaustion and anxiety. At the time, many people misunderstood what had happened. Some critics suggested she simply couldn't handle fame. Others speculated wildly without understanding the deeper reality. Years later, the explanation became clearer. Susan was eventually diagnosed with autism, a condition that made the constant noise, flashing lights, and unpredictable crowds far more overwhelming than most people realized. Imagine experiencing global fame when everyday sensory overload already feels intense. How would anyone adjust to that kind of pressure? Yet despite these challenges, Susan continued forward. Within just a few years she released multiple albums, performed in international tours, and sold millions of records around the world. Her voice, once doubted during that famous audition, had become one of the most recognizable voices in modern music. Still, success does not erase every longing. And some dreams remain quietly unfinished. A personal regret. Despite her achievements, Susan Boyle has spoken honestly about one regret that never fully left her heart. She never had children. For years she imagined having a family of her own, raising children, filling a home with laughter and music. It was a simple dream, but one she carried quietly through adulthood. At one point she even explored becoming a foster parent. She believed she could offer a safe and loving home to children who needed stability and care. But authorities did not approve the plan. The decision left her deeply disappointed. Fame had brought many things: recognition, financial security, the chance to sing for millions. But it could not give her everything she had once hoped for. And perhaps that is something many people understand as life moves forward. Success can fill certain spaces in life, but other spaces remain quietly empty. Is it possible to feel both grateful and incomplete at the same time? Susan believed it was. The stroke that nearly ended everything. Then, in April 2022, life delivered another unexpected challenge. One morning Susan woke up and immediately sensed something was wrong. Her speech felt slow and difficult. One side of her face drooped slightly. Her body felt weak, almost disconnected. She had suffered a serious stroke. Doctors quickly realized that the stroke had affected muscles critical for speech and singing. For an ordinary person, the recovery would already be daunting. For a professional singer, it felt devastating. Specialists warned that performing again might never be possible. Imagine hearing those words after dedicating a lifetime to music. The voice that had carried her from obscurity to global fame might be gone forever. Would most people accept that ending, or fight against it? Susan chose to fight. The fight to rebuild her voice. Soon after leaving the hospital, she began an intense rehabilitation routine. Speech therapy sessions, physical therapy exercises, and vocal training designed to slowly rebuild the muscles responsible for singing. 4 sessions every week. Hours of practice every day. Sometimes 5 hours at a time. Simple exercises most people take for granted suddenly required enormous concentration. Moving facial muscles, shaping sounds, rebuilding breath control. Month after month, progress came slowly. Some days were encouraging. Other days felt discouraging. But she continued. The recovery process eventually cost more than £50,000 and demanded extraordinary discipline. Yet Susan refused to stop. And then one quiet moment changed everything. In March 2023, alone at home while practicing, she tried singing "I Dreamed a Dream" again. For the first time since the stroke. The sound that emerged surprised her. It wasn't perfect, but it was unmistakably her voice. Tears filled her eyes. After months of uncertainty, the music had returned. A triumphant return. On June 3, 2023, 14 years after the audition that introduced her to the world, Susan Boyle stepped once again onto the stage where everything had begun. The audience waited in anticipation. Millions of viewers watched from their homes. And Susan sang the same song that had once stunned the judges and changed her life forever. "I Dreamed a Dream." The performance carried more meaning than anyone realized at first. Only at the end did she reveal the truth, that she had suffered a stroke the previous year and fought through months of rehabilitation just to stand there again. The audience erupted into applause. Judges rose from their seats. Performers rushed forward to embrace her. It was more than a musical moment. It was proof that resilience can rebuild what once seemed permanently lost. Preparing for another chapter. By 2025, Susan was back in the recording studio once more. For the first time in 6 years, she began working on new music. The sessions were emotional. Each note carried the memory of the long journey that had brought her back to that microphone. Fans around the world responded with overwhelming encouragement. Messages of support arrived from every corner of the globe. And then came another surprising announcement. Simon Cowell invited her to return for the 2026 anniversary season of Britain's Got Talent. The same stage where everything had started. The same platform that once introduced a shy Scottish woman to the world. What might happen if she returned again? Would the audience feel the same magic? Or would the story take yet another unexpected turn? The power of persistence. Susan Boyle's life is far more than a story about talent. It is a story about persistence. A woman once told she had brain damage. A singer who was laughed at before she even began to sing. A global star overwhelmed by sudden fame. A survivor who rebuilt her voice after a devastating stroke. And now, perhaps, a performer preparing once again to stand under the bright lights of the stage that changed her life forever. Which raises one final question. When the world tells you something is impossible, do you believe it? Or do you keep fighting until the impossible slowly begins to change? Susan Boyle chose the second path. And because of that choice, Her story continues to inspire millions of people around the world, reminding them that sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that almost disappeared.